A.3.4 Is Anarchism Pacifistic? A pacifist stand has long existed in anarchism, with Leo Tolstoy being one of its major figures. This strand is usually called anarcho-pacifism. The term nonviolent anarchist is sometimes used, but this term is unfortunate because it implies the rest of the movement are violent, which is not the case. The union of anarchism and pacifism is not surprising given the fundamental ideas and arguments of anarchism. After all, violence or the threat of violence or harm is a key means by which individual freedom is destroyed. As Peter Marshall points out, open quote, given the anarchists' respect for the sovereignty of the individual, in the long run, it is nonviolence and not violence which is implied by anarchist values, end quote. Malatesta is even more explicit when he wrote that the, open quote, main plank of anarchism is the removal of violence from human relations and that anarchists are opposed to violence, end quote. However, although many anarchists reject violence and proclaim pacifism, the movement in general is not essentially pacifistic in the sense of opposed all forms of violence at all times. Rather, it is anti-militarist, being against the organized violence of the state, but recognizing that there are important differences between the violence of the oppressor and the violence of the oppressed. This explains why the anarchist movement has always placed a lot of time and energy in opposing the military machine and capitalist wars, while at the same time supporting and organizing armed resistance against oppression. As in the case of the Makhnovist army during the Russian Revolution, which resisted both red and white armies, and the militias the anarchists organized to resist the fascists during the Spanish Revolution. See sections A.5.4 and A.5.6, respectively. On the question of nonviolence as a rough rule of thumb, the movement divides along individualist and social lines. Most individualist anarchists support purely nonviolent tactics of social change, as do the mutualists. However, individualist anarchism is not pacifist as such, as many support the idea of violence in self-defense against aggression. Most social anarchists, on the other hand, do support the use of revolutionary violence, holding that physical force will be required to overthrow entrenched power and to resist state and capitalist aggression. Although it was an anarcho-syndicalist, Bart de Ligt, who wrote the pacifist classic, The Conquest of Violence. As Malatesta put it, violence being, open quote, in itself an evil, is justifiable only when it is necessary to defend oneself and others from violence, and that a slave is always in a state of legitimate defense, and consequently, his violence against the boss, against the oppressor, is always morally justifiable, end quote. Moreover, they stress that, to use the words of Bakunin, since social oppression, open quote, stems far less from individuals than from the organization of things and from social positions, anarchists aim to ruthlessly destroy positions and things rather than people, since the aim of an anarchist revolution is to see the end of privileged classes, not as individuals, but as classes, end quote. Indeed, the question of violence is relatively unimportant to most anarchists, as they do not glorify it and think that it should be kept to a minimum during any social struggle or revolution. All anarchists would agree with the Dutch pacifist anarcho-syndicalist Bart de Ligt when he argued that, open quote, the violence and warfare which are characteristic conditions of the capitalist world do not go with the liberation of the individual, which is the historic mission of the exploited classes. The greater the violence, the weaker the revolution, even where violence has deliberately been put at the service of the revolution, end quote. Similarly, all anarchists would agree with de Ligt on, to use the name of one of his book's chapters, the absurdity of bourgeois pacifism. For de Ligt and all anarchists, violence is inherent in the capitalist system, and any attempt to make capitalism pacifistic is doomed to failure. This is because, on the one hand, war is often just economic competition carried out by other means. Nations often go to war when they face an economic crisis. What they cannot gain in economic struggle, they attempt to get by conflict. On the other hand, open quote, Violence is indispensable in modern society because without it, the ruling class would be completely unable to maintain its privileged position with regard to the exploited masses in each country. The army is used first and foremost to hold down the workers when they become discontented." End quote. As long as the state and capitalism exist, violence is inevitable, and so, for anarcho-pacifists, the consistent pacifist must be an anarchist, just as the consistent anarchist must be a pacifist. For those anarchists who are non-pacifists, violence is seen as an unavoidable and unfortunate result of oppression and exploitation, as well as the only means by which the privileged classes will renounce their power and wealth. Those in authority rarely give up their power, and so must be forced. Hence the need for, open quote, transitional violence to put an end to the far greater and permanent violence which keeps the majority of mankind in servitude, end quote. To concentrate on the issue of violence versus nonviolence is to ignore the real issue, namely, how do we change society for the better? As Alexander Berkman pointed out, those anarchists who are pacifists confuse the issue, like those who think, open quote, it's the same as if rolling up your sleeves for work should be considered the work itself. To the contrary, the fighting part of revolution is merely rolling up your sleeves. The real, actual task is ahead, end quote. And indeed, most social struggle and revolutions start relatively peaceful, via strikes, occupations, and so on, and only degenerate into violence when those in power try to maintain their position. A classic example of this is in Italy in 1920, when the occupation of factories by their workers was followed by fascist terror. See section A.5.5. As noted above, all anarchists are anti-militarists and oppose both the military machine and so the defense industry, as well as statist/capitalist wars, although a few anarchists like Rudolf Rocker and Sam Dolgoff supported the anti-fascist capitalist side during the Second World War as the lesser evil. The anti-war machine message of anarchists and anarcho-syndicalists was propagated long before the start of the First World War, with syndicalists and anarchists in Britain and North America reprinting a French CGT leaflet urging soldiers not to follow orders and repress their striking fellow workers. Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman were both arrested and deported from America for organizing a non-conscription league in 1917, while many anarchists in Europe were jailed for refusing to join the armed forces in the First and Second World Wars. The anarcho-syndicalist-influenced IWW was crushed by a ruthless wave of government repression due to the threat its organizing and anti-war message presented to the powerful elites who favored war. More recently, anarchists, including people like Noam Chomsky and Paul Goodman, have been active in the peace movement as well as contributing to the resistance to conscription where it still exists. Anarchists took an active part in opposing such wars as the Vietnam War, the Falkland War, as well as the Gulf Wars of 1991 and 2003, including in Italy and Spain, helping to organize strikes in protests against it. And it was during the 1991 Gulf War when many anarchists raised the slogan, "No war but the class war," which nicely sums up the anarchist opposition to war, namely an evil consequence of any class system in which the oppressed classes of different countries kill each other for the power and profits of their rulers. Rather than take part in this organized slaughter, anarchists urge working people to fight for their own interests, not those of their masters. Open quote. More than ever, we must avoid compromise, deepen the chasm between capitalists and wage slaves, between rulers and ruled, preach expropriation of private property and the destruction of states, such as the only means of guaranteeing fraternity between peoples and justice and liberty for all, and we must prepare to accomplish these things, end quote. We must note here that Malatesta's words were written in part against Peter Kropotkin, who, for reasons best known to himself, rejected everything he had argued for decades and supported the Allies in the First World War as a lesser evil against German authoritarianism and imperialism. Of course, as Malatesta pointed out, open quote, All governments and all capitalist classes do misdeeds against the workers and rebels of their own countries." End quote. He, along with Berkman, Goldman, and a host of other anarchists, put their name to International Anarchist Manifesto against the First World War. It expressed the opinion of the bulk of the anarchist movement at the time and consequently on war and how to stop it. It is worth quoting from, open quote, "The truth is that the cause of wars rests solely in the existence of the state, which is the form of privilege. Whatever the form it may assume, the state is nothing but organized oppression for the advantage of a privileged minority. The misfortune of the peoples who were deeply attached to peace is that in order to avoid war, they placed their confidence in the state with its intriguing diplomatists, in democracy, and in political parties. This confidence has been deliberately betrayed and continues to be so when governments, with the aid of the whole of the press, persuade the respective people that this war is a war of liberation. We are resolutely against all wars between peoples and have been, are, and ever will be most energetically opposed to war. The role of the anarchists is to continue to proclaim that there is only one war of liberation, that which in all countries is waged by the oppressed against the oppressors, by the exploited against the exploiters. Our part is to summon the slaves to revolt against their masters. Anarchist action and propaganda should assiduously and perseveringly aim at weakening and dissolving the various states, at cultivating the spirit of revolt and arousing discontent in peoples and armies. We must take advantage of all the movements of revolt, of all the discontent, in order to ferment insurrection, and to organize the revolution which we look to put end to all social wrongs. Social justice realized through the free organization of producers, war and militarism done away forever, and complete freedom won by the abolition of the state and its organs of destruction." End quote. Thus, the attraction of pacifism to anarchists is clear. Violence is authoritarian and coercive, and so its use does contradict anarchist principles. That is why anarchists would agree with Malatesta when he argues that, open quote, "We are on principle opposed to violence and for this reason wish that the social struggle should be conducted as humanely as possible." End quote. Most, if not all, anarchists who are not strict pacifists agree with pacifist anarchists when they argue that violence can often be counterproductive, alienating people and giving the state an excuse to repress both the anarchist movement and popular movements for social change. All anarchists support nonviolent direct action and civil disobedience, which often provide better roads to radical change. So, to sum up, anarchists who are pure pacifists are rare. Most accept the use of violence as a necessary evil and advocate minimizing its use. All agree that a revolution which institutionalizes violence will just recreate the state in a new form. They argue, however, that it is not authoritarian to destroy authority or to use violence to resist violence. Therefore, although most anarchists are not pacifists, most reject violence except in self-defense, and even then kept to the minimum.